I'm Gerald McKenney and from the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. I am delighted to have been asked to be the moderator of this particular panel, both for the topic, which greatly interests me, but especially for the three people who have the task today of delivering papers. I am going to introduce all three of them at the outset in order to avoid interruptions. The papers will run, or the talks, I should say talks, will run from 15 to 20 minutes each, and that should give us some time towards the end for people to engage in discussion. So in order to avoid any more loss of time, I will, as I say, introduce each of the three, beginning with Professor John Cavadini. John Cavadini is Professor of Theology and McGrath Cavadini, Director of the Institute for Church Life here at the University of Notre Dame. He serves on the International Theological Commission and is a member of the Equestrian Order of St. Gregory the Great, both at the appointment of Pope Benedict XVI. Widely regarded by his peers as the leading scholar of St. Augustine of his generation, he is the author of many publications on Augustine and other Latin patristic authors, and also on contemporary theology. Two of his articles on Augustine, one on sexuality and another on the self, have already achieved the status of classics of modern Augustine scholarship. A scholar of the first rank, an administrator who has had enormous impact on the Department of Theology and the Institute for Church Life, and through them, the entire university, one of Notre Dame's most outstanding teachers, and one who has made incalculable contributions to Catholic life and thought as a lay leader. Through his deep and generous faith, John Cavadini has also had an enormous influence on many people of faith at Notre Dame and beyond who are not Catholic. So I'm pleased to welcome John Cavadini to join us this afternoon. Our second speaker is Professor Brad Gregory. Professor Gregory is the Dorothy G. Griffin Professor of Early Modern European History at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in Christianity in the Reformation era of the 16th and 17th centuries, spanning both the magisterial and radical versions of Protestantism, as well as Roman Catholicism. His widely acclaimed book on the martyrs of these centuries, Salvation at Stake, that has to be one of the best titles for a book on martyrs that I could ever imagine, is notable for its attention to the doctrinal motives in the face of historical interpretations that have for a long time now focused on other things to the neglect of theology. So that was a major, both a methodological achievement as well as an achievement of historical scholarship. His recent book, The Unintended Reformation, is an astonishingly broad and rich interpretation of the unintended effects of the Reformation era for the intellectual, cultural, and political world we all inhabit today, and it is justly receiving a great deal of attention throughout the academy and beyond. Professor Gregory is not only a renowned scholar, but he's also an award-winning teacher. We are delighted to have him on the panel this afternoon. Finally, Mary Keyes is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Her scholarship also has a breathtaking reach, ranging from ancient Greek to medieval to modern ethics and political theory. Her book, Aquinas, Aristotle, and the Promise of the Common Good, indicates that range in its title, but its title hardly does justice to the depth and breadth of scholarship and engagement with political theory throughout the book. It combines a powerful critique of John Rawls, Michael Sandel, and William Galston, contemporary liberal political theorists, and some anti-liberal, a dose of anti-liberalism in there as well, It combines these analyses and critiques with very careful analysis, defense, and retrieval of an Aristotelian Thomist concept of the good, or maybe we could say a Thomist Aristotelian concept of the good. So, Professor Keyes has also held visiting appointments at Harvard, visiting faculty appointments at Harvard University and the University of Chicago, indicating the esteem she is, in which she is held among her colleagues. And I know from students who have taken her classes that she is both a beloved and a very challenging teacher. And I admire anyone who can pull off those two things at once. So we're delighted also to have Professor Keyes here. So please join me in welcoming the three of them. And we will begin now with Professor Cavadini.
Thank you. Friends, through no fault of the organizers, but through my own inattention, I didn't realize I had only 20 minutes, so I'm only going to do 3 little case studies instead of 4, with apologies. What's the relation between justice and love in the Christian tradition? Justice may be the crowning glory of the virtues, but there is no encyclical letter called God is Justice. My sole attempt at humor.
That was the second.
Thank you. And that is because it says nowhere in Scripture that God is, and that is because it says in Scripture that God is love. It is interesting to think about what it would have meant if it said in the first letter of John that God is justice. Both Judaism and Catholicism are religions heavily indebted to the idea of law and of justice, but in neither could it be said without qualification that God is justice, in the same way that it is said in the New Testament that God is love, and in the book of Exodus that God's judgment extends to the 4th generation, but his mercy to the 1,000th. This then brings up the subject of my brief reflection, namely the relation between justice and love in the Christian tradition. To make it more specific, maybe the relation between social justice and love in the Christian tradition. So let's consider 3 sources or mini-studies of this question, 1 ancient and 2 modern. And I've tried to juxtapose people who aren't maybe normally juxtaposed. To begin with St. Augustine, who takes up the question of the relation between social justice and love as the relation between justice and mercy. There is, of course, no fully developed social teaching in the Fathers, if by that is meant a systematic analysis of something we now call society, res socialis, with clearly articulated fundamental principles relating to its well-being. Nevertheless, the Fathers did comment extensively on the poor and on the responsibility of Christians to care for the poor. St. Augustine, in particular, fills his sermons full of exhortations to give alms, to care for the poor, and thus to perform works of mercy. There is, however, no strict separation between mercy and justice. Commenting on Psalm 49:5, gather his just ones to him, Augustine comments, and who are the just? Those who live by faith and perform works of mercy, for works of mercy are works of justice. End quote. The just are those who have treated the helpless with mercy and have understood about the needy and the poor. That's from Enumerationes in Psalmos 49. In fact, the standard of justice, the justice which the heavens will proclaim, and the price that Christ the judge will exact for entrance into the kingdom of heaven, is the mercy enjoined by Matthew 25. Come, you whom my Father has blessed, take possession of what? The kingdom. And what price have they paid for it? I was hungry and you fed me. End quote. Augustine connects this to the teaching on justice in the book of Isaiah, where we find the exhortation, break your bread for the hungry and take the person with no shelter into your home. If you see anyone naked, clothe him. Cited at Enumerationes in Psalm 49. In other words, the justice that Christians are obliged to work in the world is not a worldly form of justice, or even one that can be fully understood from the perspective of philosophy or unaided reason, because what one owes in justice has been recalibrated by God's acts of mercy in the economy of salvation revealed in Scripture. To put it most succinctly, God's mercy is his self-emptying solidarity with us, fulfilled and enacted in the Incarnation. This self-emptying is so complete that the God who can say, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine in all its fullness," nevertheless did graciously will to be hungry for our sake and became poor for us. Quotations from 2 sermons. Because of Christ's mercy, we see in the flesh of the poor and hungry the true flesh of Christ, and our works of mercy on their behalf, truly, by his grace, are feeding and sheltering Christ, accepting his economy of mercy as setting the standards of what justice means and what obligations it will impose. For it is not only Christ's mercy that is revealed in the Incarnation and the associated economy, but the poor and needy person as the true icon or image of all of humanity. The church is in the world as the continuing locus of this revelation. Quote, "All the members of Christ, the body of Christ diffused throughout the world, are like a single person asking God's help, one single beggar, one poor suppliant. And this is because Christ himself is that poor man, since he who was rich became poor, as the apostle tells us, though he was rich, he became poor, so that by his poverty you might be enriched," end quote. Christ's mercy, binding human beings into the unity of one person, reveals the worth of humanity as consisting not in any observable human distinctions or even human virtues, but rather its poverty, its bare humanness as the object of God's mercy. Almsgiving is thus to be based on need and not on the perceived virtue or goodness of any person. That is, it is based on their humanity as such. And it is all the better if one can even remedy the need of someone in person, thus emphasizing the bond of sympathy that finds its basis in our common humanity, from Sermon 259. Our neediness as seen and revealed from the mercy of Christ, and not in any further virtue, qualification, or achievement. To move to a contemporary theologian is to find this theme developed further in the form of the preferential option for the poor. In his book on Job, theologian Gustavo Gutierrez explores the relation between justice and love that is implied in the idea of a preferential option for the poor. Contrary to popular belief, the preferential option for the poor is first and foremost a doctrine about God and not about the poor. Quote, "The ultimate basis of God's preference for the poor is to be found in God's own goodness and not in any analysis of society or in human compassion, however pertinent these reasons might be," end quote. If the poor and the little ones are the privileged addressees of revelation, this, quote, "is the result not primarily of moral or spiritual dispositions, but of a human situation in which God undertakes self-revelation by acting and overturning values and criteria. The scorned of this world are those whom the God of love prefers," end quote. We are confronted with a mystery of God's transcendent love that cannot be reduced to human reason, because it is a preference based in God's goodness. Again, quote, "This special love for the poor does not have for its ultimate motive the virtues and merits of the poor, but the goodness and freedom of God, a God who is not simply the guardian of a rigid moral order," end quote. Gustavo Gutierrez says that the Christian must speak in 2 languages. Quote, "Mystical language expresses the gratuitousness of God's love. Prophetic language, the demands this love makes," end quote. Ultimately, Gutierrez says we must learn to join these languages into one language, to speak one language, which, he says, is the language of the cross. Jesus, in his cry of dereliction on the cross, spoke in solidarity with all the abandoned, in evoking Psalm 22 on the cross. Quote, "His cry on the cross renders more audible and more penetrating the cries of all the Jobs, individual and collective of human history," end quote. Just as in St. Augustine's case, the revelation in Christ recontextualizes justice from a purely human point of view, and it becomes impossible to refer to justice without a wider and prior reference to God's mercy. St. Augustine says that Christ, in his cry of desolation on the cross, in the Enarrationes in Samos that I was quoting from before, gives voice to all of the desolation of the human race by speaking it in our person, and thereby transfigures our voice into his. The more desolate and despised the voice we hear, the more we hear Christ speaking in the voice, the more we hear God's mercy speaking, and the more we are called to prefer these voices, hearing in them the one language of justice and mercy which Jesus spoke from the cross. Without the preferential option for the poor, as grounded in God's goodness, the language of justice can quickly be truncated into a sclerotic moralism with no proper connection to anything truly human or humane. This observation leads us to our third source, Pope Benedict XVI, whose encyclical God is Love carries forward the themes we have already observed in St. Augustine and Gustavo Gutierrez. We find once again that justice for the Christian is contextualized in and by love. What is justice? Quote, "The problem is one of practical reason, but if reason is to be exercised properly, it must undergo constant purification, since it can never be completely free of the danger of a certain ethical blindness caused by the dazzling effect of power and special interests," end quote. Truly to see the human person is to see him or her from the perspective of the Eucharistic gift of Christ's self. From the point of view of communion with this sacrifice, we encounter a sacramental mysticism which is social in character, such that, quote, "union with Christ is also union with all those to whom he gives himself, which is every person." Our idea of justice must be purified by this sacramental mysticism so that it resists all narrowness and must be supplemented by the awareness that we have not met all human needs if we attempt to exclude love. Quote, "There is no ordering of the state so just that it can eliminate the need for a service of love. Whoever wants to eliminate love is preparing to eliminate the human being as such. There will always be suffering which cries out for consolation and help. There will always be loneliness. There will always be situations of material need where help in the form of concrete love of neighbor is indispensable," end quote. The notion of justice withers away into something incommensurate with the fullness of humanity if it is separated from love. The church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice, but this does not mean relinquishing all human caring into the hands of the state. For the state which absorbs all human caring into itself becomes, quote, "a mere bureaucracy, incapable of guaranteeing the very thing which the suffering person, every person needs, namely, loving personal concern," end quote. The Church's charitable works as works of love are proper to her person and are irreplaceable because they are witness to the wider worth of human beings beyond their utility to the state that grounds all struggles for justice and a proper sense of humanity. Benedict pointedly notes, quote, "We do not need a state which regulates and controls everything, but a state which, in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, generously acknowledges and supports initiatives arising from the different social forces and combines spontaneity with closeness to those in need. The Church is one of those living forces. She is alive with the love enkindled by the Spirit of Christ," end quote. "Love is the light, and in the end the only light," that's a quote, "in which the needs of human beings can be fully and finally seen, assessed, and met. Love is the light in which we see the true dimensions and scope of social justice. Catholic social teaching has the aim of bringing this light to bear on the very question of justice itself. We have seen this each in their own way in St. Augustine and in Gustavo Gutierrez. Benedict sums it up this way. From God's standpoint, faith liberates reason from its blind spots and therefore helps it to be ever more fully itself. Faith enables reason to do its work more effectively and to see its proper object more clearly. This is where Catholic social doctrine has its place. It has no intention of giving the Church power over the state. Even less is it an attempt to impose on those who do not share the faith ways of thinking and modes of conduct proper to the faith. Its aim is simply to help purify reason and to contribute here and now to the acknowledgement and attainment of what is just." And friends, I'm leaving out my fourth little case study and skipping to the end. If I can find the end. If love is the light, then this is a world illuminated by God's preference for the poor, a world illuminated by the alms of the passion and death of Christ, a world in the end illuminated by the saints who remind us of the truth of human dignity and the source of all justice. Perhaps then it is not as irrelevant as it may have seemed on a casual reading to end the encyclical God is Love with a meditation on the saints. For the saints are not merely for the church, her narrow possession, but for the world. They train the imagination toward the light of love, not in the abstract, but as the true bearers of light within history, reinventing everyone's imagination according to the possibilities which love offers, and so according to the demands that true justice requires. Thank you.
Before I begin, I want to know who your fourth case study was, John.
My fourth mini-study was Simone Weil.
Just to increase the disappointment of the audience. Thanks. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to Carter Sneed for the invitation as well, and to Jerry for participating as the moderator. This is an absurdly brief paper about a very big topic under the rubric Justice and the Christian Tradition, but it seems to me worth offering a compressed historical sketch of the paradoxical way in which Christians themselves bear the chief responsibility for the secularization of justice in the Western world. We are apt not to see this because it was a long-term process with its roots in the 16th and 17th centuries. What happened, in a nutshell, is that the political protection of individual rights to freedom of religion that began in the United States in the late 18th century provided an institutional solution to the problems inherited from the Reformation era. But this protection simultaneously created the framework for the eventual exclusion of religion from public life and the exercise of individual rights as an expression of preferential desires. The solution to one problem has turned out to be the foundation for others. What we're seeing in the US today, it seems to me, is how our deeply embedded emphasis on individual rights and self-determination increasingly makes the identification of a substantive common good and an understanding of justice difficult, if not impossible. To the extent that citizens diverge about what is good, right, true, fair, and just, pressure is placed on government to become more legislatively coercive and morally proactive, because unlegislated religious commitments no longer serve as a source of societal cohesion and instead reflect the polarization of politics and morality at large. It would be edifying, perhaps, and comforting if we could blame the displacement of a substantive Christian ethics of the good by a formal secular ethics of rights on anti-religious ideologies in the Enlightenment, say, or on the consumeristic individualism so pervasive in the US and other Western countries, especially since the 1960s. Then, like Ross Douthat, we could look back to the 1950s and before as the time of good religion, when mainstream American Protestants and Catholics believed and behaved in ways that positively informed the country's civic culture, before bad religion began to corrode both faith and public life. Then, ecumenically minded Christians would have a common enemy in the culture wars, and other we could blame, perhaps as we endeavor to elect politicians that we think will pass legislation infused with a Christian understanding of justice. But however edifying and useful such a perspective and project might be, it would sidestep the deeper, more sobering historical reasons that led to the exclusion of contested religious commitments from the secular justice that today adjudicates disputes among individuals who determine their respective goods for themselves. As I have argued at length in my recent book, The Unintended Reformation, and yes, I hope you'll all go out and buy it now if you haven't already, the advent of modern moral philosophy and political thought, the modern control of churches by states, and the modern emergence of a formal ethics of rights, all of which are intertwined with the secularization of justice, have their origins in the unresolved doctrinal disagreements and the concrete religio-political conflicts between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. What I would like to suggest is, first, that these disagreements and conflicts provided the ideological and the institutional springboards for the secularization of justice, and second, that this secularization nevertheless continued to depend on Christianity in critical ways that ironically are becoming clearer recently, in proportion to the extent to which they are being challenged and rejected. We begin to see how much was taken for granted only once it no longer is. So then, here is an attempt to make the explanatorily powerful narrative as absurdly concise as possible. Late medieval Christianity was not religion in the modern sense of beliefs, worship, and devotional practices set apart from the rest of human life. It was an institutionalized worldview meant to inform all of life's domains. Neither homogeneous nor uniform, to say nothing of harmonious, in terms of the exercise of power and legal practice, it comprised an unsystematic, frequently messy, locally variegated combination of cross-cutting jurisdictions responsible for the administration of justice, whether ecclesiastical or secular. Late medieval town magistrates or sovereign rulers were secular only in the institutional and jurisdictional sense of being non-ecclesiastical. They were well aware that the articulation of human laws and implementation of justice for which they were responsible was supposed to reflect divine justice, which is why, for example, paintings of the Last Judgment were common in medieval civic courtrooms. The common, egregious medieval gulf between Christian teachings and behaviors inspired waves of reformers between the 12th and the early 16th centuries. The pervasive, long-standing problems of medieval Christendom prompted action by those who cared about trying to make realities align more closely with ideals. The Protestant Reformation attempted to remedy the problems in church and society based on the view that Christians' manifest sinfulness was symptomatic of the church's false teachings. Before reforms actually willed by God could address the problems, true doctrine had to be rescued from centuries of extra-biblical accretions and the corrupting influences of pagan philosophies. According to those who rejected the Roman Church, the basis for doing so was God's word alone, in Scripture, the sole genuine source for Christian faith and life. Among the many anti-Roman Christians who made claims about the meaning and application of God's word beginning in the early 1520s, only Lutherans and Reformed Protestants received backing from secular authorities, analogous to that given by Catholic rulers in their polities. By the second half of the 16th century, secular authorities were calling the shots in all of Europe's confessional regimes, whether Catholic or Protestant. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about Philip II or Elizabeth I. The issues at stake were critically important and included the proper exercise of justice in ways thought to reflect obedience to God, promoting the common good and fostering subjects' eternal salvation. Hence, conscientious Catholic and Protestant rulers prosecuted religious dissenters according to their respective laws and were involved in military conflicts from the unrest of the early German Reformation in the 1520s through the 30 Years' War and English Revolution of the mid-17th century. These conflicts were expensive, destructive, and inconclusive. By the mid-17th century, what had they accomplished? At the end of the 30 Years' War, exhausted Europeans, understandably, were less than keen on the prospect of additional rounds of future conflict. Christianity was crucial for societal cohesion and integral to conceptions of justice, yet at the same time problematic, because Christians were divided about the meaning and application of God's truth in ordering society, exercising power, and administering justice. So what was to be done? Doctrinal controversy and exegetical disagreement were no closer to resolution in the mid-17th century than they had been in the 1520s. In sharp contrast to ecumenical relations among Christians today, nearly all theologians continued to polemicize against their opponents and to emphasize the issues that divided them. Any potential supra-confessional solution to the problem in intellectual terms would have to avoid reference to those things about which Christians disagreed, namely, everything related to divisive doctrines regarding authority, scripture, grace, salvation, ecclesiology, the sacraments, liturgy, ministry, and so forth. This, of course, was much of the substance of the Christian faith. However, it was confessionally expressed. Hence, we can understand the 17th century turns in modern thought toward reason alone, without reference to authority or tradition, paradigmatically present, of course, in Descartes, toward natural law, but based on individual organisms' desire for self-preservation, as in Grotius or Hobbes, rather than, for example, on Aquinas' conception of natural law as nothing else than the rational creature's participation in God's eternal law. And we can understand the turn toward natural theology in the modern sense among post-Newtonian thinkers who sought to set Christianity on foundations that could avoid controverted theology. In intellectual terms, then, the goal was to discover or to construct a persuasive, non-confessional basis for morality, politics, and justice. In institutional terms, any potential solution to the problem of Christianity as the source of both cohesion and conflict would have to apply to individuals, because it was individuals who disagreed about God's truth. It was radical Protestants, above all, who made this evident and who argued the point, from Sebastian Castellio in the mid-16th century to Roger Williams in the 17th and beyond. The institutional solution, seemingly so obvious to us in retrospect, was freedom of religion in a modern sense, permitting each person to believe according to her conscience, worship God as she saw fit, and engage in her preferred devotional practices. As James Madison put it in the U.S. in 1785, it is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. But note what freedom of religion in this sense implies. Not only the individual self-determination of religious truth, but a conception of religion as something separate and separable from the rest of human life. It presupposes a separation between public and private spheres, as well as an anthropological dichotomy between human souls, consciences, beliefs, and interiority on the one hand, and human bodies, actions, behaviors, and exteriority on the other. A precondition for modern freedom of religion is the redefinition of religion as something that is, can be, and should be separated from the exercise of power, economic behavior, and the administration of justice. Sometimes overlooked is that those religiously free and protected individual human consciences were and are united with individual human bodies that are subject to political control by the state. The secularization of justice derived from Christians' divisive disagreements in the Reformation era, disagreements that in diverse expressions today continue to present challenges to Christian ecumenical efforts. Because Catholics and Protestants disagreed about the Christian good in ways that were socially divisive and sometimes politically disruptive, political authorities allowed individuals to believe as they pleased and worship as they wished in exchange for obedience to the state's laws. This was first practiced de facto in the commercially successful 17th century Dutch Republic. It was first institutionalized in the US in the late 18th century. But in what then would the governing laws be grounded? And what would they be for if they couldn't refer to God's revealed truth or implicate any of the contested doctrinal issues that continue to divide Christians? The American founding fathers got around this difficulty by drawing on Christian beliefs that were not disputed while avoiding those that were. They expressed in non-confessional ways fundamental Christian notions that were not divisive in the early modern period. For example, that there is a creator God, that all human beings are created by God in his image and likeness, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Jefferson said in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, not because they actually are, but because they were not among the truth claims disputed at the time. Nor had they been disputed in the Reformation era. Hence, they could be and were taken for granted because the American founders did not disagree about them despite their religious diversity. Therefore, these beliefs could and did contribute to the construction of a shared political framework for law, public morality, and justice. Nor should we overlook or downplay the fact that these beliefs provided a basis for the subsequent extension of the administration of justice in ways consistent with fundamental Christian teachings to those who had been excluded from fair treatment in the social hierarchies of medieval and early modern Europe. You know, when European society was Christian. In this sense, and in the later abolition of slavery and extension of civil rights to women and minorities under the law, the founding documents of the U.S. provided a framework for extending aspects of justice implicit in Christian claims, but which had been in critical ways ignored for many centuries in Christian civilization. So in keeping with observations by Charles Taylor and others, in this sense we can say, paradoxically, that the secularization of justice fostered the greater extension of Christian values and truth claims about the createdness of every person by God and thus deserving of fair and equal treatment under just laws. But this is not the whole story. a unilaterally celebratory view of Christianity's contribution to modern human rights overlooks the wider context of beliefs and practices in which those rights had been embedded, and from which, in modern articulations, they have been dislodged. Simply to champion human rights, without asking questions about their relationship to divergent conceptions of morality or human beings, for example, leaves us ill-equipped to understand the character of our contemporary disagreements related to rights and justice. The formulations about God as creator and about inalienable rights in the founding documents of the U.S. were supplemented by the social fact that the fledgling country was, as John Butler has put it, awash in a sea of faith. Beginning in the 1790s, the powerful evangelical movement traditionally called the Second Great Awakening strongly shaped American public life up to the Civil War with its revivalist, affective Protestantism. Yet throughout those decades, the founding documents of the U.S. remained as deliberately thin and non-prescriptive as they had been from the beginning. They named life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as among the inalienable rights of all men. Yet because of the inherited disagreements from the Reformation era, they said nothing at all about how to live, what liberty means, or what the pursuit of happiness entails. In practice, for much of the United States history, the content of the answers to these and other fundamental questions has come from the social institutions most important for inculcating them, namely churches and families. In principle, though, because of the political protection of individual rights, provision for such answers has always been a matter of individual self-determination. When Tocqueville visited the U.S. in the early 1830s, he was astounded to see how voluntary membership in churches coexisted symbiotically with laws and government in ways that made, as he said, religion the first of Americans' political institutions. Quote, "There is an innumerable multitude of sects in the United States," he wrote. "They are all different in the worship they offer to the Creator, but all agree concerning the duties of men to one another." That is, churchgoers shared a sense of moral obligations that could and did inform public life, despite federal disestablishment and the institutional separation of church and state. Tocqueville continues, "Each sect worships God in its own fashion, but all preach the same morality in the name of God. Indeed, all the sects in the United States belong to the great unity of Christendom, and Christian morality is everywhere the same." That is, despite their denominational differences, the individuals whose rights were protected shared basic assumptions about the good and what laws ought to be enacted and enforced to protect and promote it. Not so much anymore. This basic consensus has now broken down and is continuing to break down in what Princeton historian Daniel Rogers has recently analyzed as the age of fracture. Americans emphatically do not all preach the same morality, whether in the name of God or something else, and our poisoned public sphere, as Anthony Grafton has called it, reflects the resulting acrimony. Much of what was generally long taken for granted under the penumbra of a Protestant moral establishment, to use David Sahat's phrase, no longer is or can be taken for granted. Indeed, depending on one's audience, it seems increasingly difficult even to argue for basic moral claims, because so many other assumptions and issues must be addressed first, or at least simultaneously. And think here of the glazed over eyes and furrowed brows when you try to make arguments on the basis of natural law to colleagues who do not accept the category. What no longer can be assumed is very much shared content once individuals exercise their rights in determining their own respective goods. In this, we are our own authorities. As Pat Benatar, that acute observer of contemporary American life, put it in Love is a Battlefield, no one can tell us we're wrong. American freedom of religion has always implied the option of unbelief. Indeed, it is the freedom to believe whatever and to behave however one wishes within the laws. And as laws are changed to make more behaviors legal in order to expand individual choice, the de facto summum bonum, we see the incremental secularization of justice in choices contrary to Christian values and claims. When Christians exercise their rights to choose goods at odds with those recognizable as Christian, the collective result is an increasingly secular society whose members in turn favor increasingly secular laws and conceptions of justice. Many people in the US today, it seems to me, find it difficult even to imagine that laws and justice could be anything but what human beings construct as a function of majority vote and judicial action. Human rights not only protect citizens from harm, but also serve to legitimate the maximization of individual choice, with laws serving as the facilitator of this maximization and justice functioning to adjudicate among citizens' competing preferences. There is no substantive common good. The inalienable right to life has become a deadlocked dispute about who is human, centered around the beginning and end of life, and on whether some disabilities indeed disqualify certain people from being people at all. The inalienable right to life, to liberty, is filled by voluntaristic individual preferences, whatever they happen to be, so long as they are legal. And the inalienable right to the pursuit of happiness is a corollary of this exercise of liberty. Happiness is whatever makes you happy, however you define it, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. So where do we go from here? That's the subject for another paper, not a few concluding remarks, and it's one that as a historian I'm not sure I would venture. But as a Catholic, it seems important to say something, in a way consistent with Professor McIntyre's comment yesterday about the ruthlessly truthful recognition of our fallenness not tempting us to hopelessness. I think we ought to reject thinking and acting in macro-scale terms about how to fix civil society through politics as presently constituted. Catholics cannot ignore politics insofar as we are embodied souls, and the exercise of power hugely affects human flourishing. But we distort and diminish the faith as an integral worldview if we reduce ourselves to Catholics, as Catholics, to political conservatives or liberals, or identify with either of the two grossly un-Catholic American political parties. Our broken political system is symptomatic of deeper metaphysical and ethical problems that are the product of a tangled history. Catholic intellectuals should seek in their respective disciplines to disentangle the history in ways that illuminate the complex consequences of practical missteps and ideological mistakes. But Christianity is most fundamentally a shared way of life, not an intellectual system. So more importantly, all Catholics should seek justice and practice caritas and enact concrete care for others in their local, immediate circumstances, participating in groups and institutions dedicated to those practices in ways that might lead others to want to share our faith. We should love our neighbors as ourselves. In our human relationships and our actions, we should endeavor to make the faith too beautiful and good to dismiss, too appealing and attractive to ignore. Our federal and state laws do not, at least thus far, prevent any of us from leading lives that unflinchingly pursue justice and enact charity in imitation of Christ. Let's take heart from that and seize the opportunities our secular state affords to live holy lives.
Well, all roads lead to Augustine. They lead back. So the panel began and it's going to finish with reflections on Augustine. That was not planned, but not surprising since we have the guru here. But also, in many ways, I think Professor Gregory's paper also shows reasons for returning to Augustine. Unlike Thomas Aquinas, Augustine was doing his work of theology and also of philosophy and political theory in a time of great fragmentation, very different from our own, but fragmented nonetheless. And you can see this in the City of God from his survey of literally hundreds of philosophical schools that have fractured off one from another, giving different answers to what the good life should mean for human beings, also together with the religious and to some extent political conflicts going on at the time as well. So back we come to Augustine. Professor Cavadini's presentation focused on the relationship between justice and love. Augustine once beautifully described humility, which is the focus of my reflections today, as, and I quote, the dwelling place of charity. Humility is where charity is at home, where it lives, where it flourishes. In my presentation, I'd like to suggest that for Augustine, it's also true that humility is the foundation for justice, that in a deep sense, humility is justice, according to human nature, although it also prompts us to seek our happiness beyond human nature. Reading Augustine as I do, I have no choice, it's who I am, as a political theorist, interested in ethical and religious questions, not as a professional and learned theologian. I'm interested in these questions, especially as they intersect with civic life and with society as it interrelates with politics. My focus today will be on a reading of Augustine's City of God, books 1 through 5. And it's those of you who've read portions of or seen the City of God will know it's a massive work, 22 books long, 1,000 some pages in its latest or some of its latest English translations. Yeah, a little slim volume for your leisure reading, but worth the read for those who have, well worth the read for those who haven't read it. So it's 22 books long, and my paper will focus, I'm summarizing a longer paper here. I'd be happy to send the paper to anyone who would be interested. We'll focus on the first 5 books for a few reasons, but most importantly for 2. One is books 1 through 5 seems to me as a segment, the most important complete segment that deals with politics in the most, the most political segment of Augustine's City of God. Book 19 also deals with politics. It's the most famous treatment of politics, and not unjustly so. But in books 1 through 5, Augustine is arguing that pagan worship did not further justice and happiness in the ancient Roman Empire. And so he's looking at political happiness as it intertwines with familial and personal happiness, and justice as it exists, or rather didn't exist largely, in the pre-Christian Roman politics. So it's a very political segment and very focused on the question of justice. Secondly, I read books 1 through 5 as foreshadowing brilliantly Augustine's entire argument in the City of God. It's just a couple hundred pages of his book, and yet if you read that, you will understand the core of the argument he's making throughout the whole. And it also prepares you to go more deeply into the different segments of the case he wants to make for Christianity against ancient pagan religions. Excuse me here. The audiences of the City of God, as many of you know well, again, many and varied. But at the same time, there are 2 that I think are the chief audiences Augustine is trying to address. Also, you could say the interlocutors, the type of interlocutor he wants to engage in a persuasive dialogue, trying to bring his reader along with him to the end of his argument. The primary interlocutor is, you could say, the contemporary of Augustine, who is a confused Christian citizen of the declining and falling Western Roman Empire. So the confused Christian who has heard too many arguments that to the effect that Christianity is to blame for his or her polity's current decline and imminent destruction, or at least collapse, political collapse. So Augustine once, as a pastor, is seeking to build up his flock and to console and to instruct people as to why they should not be persuaded by the arguments made by so many average citizen, you could say, and intellectual elite pagan contemporaries. But the audience I'm most interested in, I think, is also near and dear to Augustine's heart. And that is, you could to think of it as a single person, as the liberally educated, perhaps also philosophic, pagan citizen, compatriot, share in the political rises, fortunes, and here now declines and falls. And Augustine makes it clear from the outset of his work that he hopes to invite open-minded, fair-minded, seriously truth-seeking pagans to come along with him to see the need to seek citizenship in a better empire, but also along the way to realize that Christianity is not the cause, is not the root of his or her empire's collapse. So for these readers, who would include political philosophers of the Platonic and Aristotelian and other Stoic schools, I think clearly Augustine is trying to show them how humility, in books 1 through 5 especially, but throughout the whole work, how humility which without quoting a systematic definition Augustine gives, but he doesn't define it in this book as far as I can tell, but it seems to be something like this. The proper, truthful love of excellence in oneself as a creature of God, oneself understood as one's person, okay, understood as a creature of God, and so as an equal among God's human children, always subordinate to and dependent upon God for everything good. So I read Augustine as, among other things, arguing that humility constitutes the foundation of justice according to human nature. He would like his pagan interlocutor to follow him that far in these 5 books. In other words, what the classical philosophers often refer to as natural right, again, the foundational just state of affairs that answers to what human nature truly is, that what they've been seeking as justice according to nature, they will never fully understand if they don't understand our relationship as creatures, human creatures, to a divine creator, and so understand what humility is based on, although it doesn't stop there. Excuse me. So this thematic is introduced by Augustine in his very preface, and I'll read you the first two paragraphs of the City of God. Most glorious is the city of God, whether in this passing age, where she dwells by faith as a pilgrim among the ungodly, or in the security of that eternal home which she now patiently awaits until righteousness shall return unto judgment, but which she will then possess perfectly in final victory and perfect peace. In this work, O Marcellinus, my beloved son, due to you by my promise, I have undertaken to defend her against those who favor their own gods above her founder. The work is great and arduous, but God is our helper. I know, however, what efforts are needed to persuade the proud how great is that virtue of humility, which not by dint of any human loftiness, but by divine grace bestowed from on high, raises us above all the earthly pinnacles which sway in this inconstant age. For the King and founder of this city, of which we are resolved to speak, has revealed a maxim of the divine law in the scriptures of his people, where it is said, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. But the swollen fancy of the proud-spirited envies even this utterance, which belongs to God, and loves to hear the following words spoken in its own praise. And here he quotes Virgil from the Aeneid, to spare the humble and to subdue the proud is the task of Rome. So Augustine makes it clear then from the outset of his work at the beginning of Book 1 that his defense of Christianity from charges that it's the cause of Rome's ongoing political disaster is also a defense of humility and its goodness in human life, including social and civic life. Humility, as Augustine tells us here, is a maxim of the divine law, something we learn through sacred scripture that Jews and Christians alike can understand. And yet, Augustine also wants to take on the difficult task of persuading the pagans, of opening the pagans to humility's goodness and its justice. It's a hard task, very hard, but not impossible. And so it seems to me that in addressing his pagan readers, Augustine must be seeking a foothold for humility in human nature. He can't begin from sacred scripture to argue with a Stoic or Platonic philosopher, with a Ciceronian statesman. He has to say something about what it means to be human that they can relate to, that is rooted in human experience, that's rooted in our common human life, that we have access to and can philosophize about. And it seems that on reading books 1 through 5, Augustine finds that foothold, that epistemic foothold, where people can begin to understand humility, not in humility itself, but in looking at its opposite, and looking at pride, and what pride does, superbia, this crazy love of one's own excellence, as if one were the absolute, or one's polity was, the God to whom all else should worship. He looks at superbia in political life, and he shows in a growing, a way that builds to a crescendo by book 3, that pride is the cause of the worst misery that Rome has undergone, that this love of excellence that then morphs into love of domination is the cause of misery and oppression and injustice, and that one does not have to be a Jew or a Christian to appreciate this. All one has to do is read the pagan historians with an open mind, and you'll see, Augustine seems to suggest, come along with me this far and realize that pride goes against human nature and stokes the worst forms of injustices our city has seen. So just a outline, a sketch here of Augustine's argument. I'll be giving the briefest sketch that I possibly can in the next max 10 minutes. But it's a rich argument and a very detailed one. Augustine is not engaged in a geometric proof. He's not trying to give a philosophic demonstration in a very, I could say, clean and neat way. It's a work of rhetoric that appeals to and engages philosophic as well as theological and historical argument, but rhetoric designed to move the heart and the mind to open, to come along, to follow along with his argument, so that one would be in a position to think longer and harder on one's own, to understand what humility is according to human nature, and he hopes from there to see the need for divine grace. So in books 1 through 3, then, as I've already said, Augustine begins from, you could say, the political pathologies of pride. And I'll say more about a couple of those in just a moment. Then in books 4 and 5, having hopefully convinced a few of his readers who are not yet Christians that pride is injustice at its core, he then begins a positive case for a virtue that the classical philosophers, every one of them as far as I know, well, I think in some way every one of them, even the Epicureans, classical Epicureans, would acknowledge, which is the virtue of moderation. He makes a case for a virtue that's not synonymous with, but that is analogous to humility, that has to do with appreciating the proper human measure, the measure of desires, the measure of excellence in human life. And from there, he moves to allude to, in very clear and explicit ways, the need for something like a Platonic metaphysics of soul and of cosmos and of the author of soul and cosmos, God, to appreciate the truth of our human nature as far as philosophy can go. And so to come to something like a philosophic humility that, again, prepares the way for the need for specifically Christian humility. Okay. In Book 1, very briefly, Augustine starts by showing, and very early in Book 1, how pride, what he calls ungrateful pride, obscures pagan citizens' social and civic vision, how many of them haven't been able to appreciate important aspects of the reality that they're living in their current political life and the causes of those realities. So he gives two examples, just very briefly. The first is, let's see here, the first is the fact that Christianity has made Alaric and the Visigoths' sack of Rome a lot less violent, a lot less cruel than it could have been. It was no cakewalk, it was horrible, but there was much more mercy, much more active mercy, and many more citizens were spared. Many of the conquerors were trying to help the conquered flee to safety. And Augustine says, can't you see that this would have been impossible if a majority of the armed forces fighting against us hadn't embraced some form of Christianity, and several of them apparently quite seriously, given the way they acted. So, but because of pride, you say, we're the cause. Can't you see that this actually, Christianity has made this a lot better than it could have been, bad as it is. Secondly, he points out that many of the Roman pagans, at least some very vocal ones, let's say, have been humiliating, making fun of, ridiculing Christian women especially, who were the victims of sexual assault during the city's sack by the Visigoths. And Augustine suggests, well, supposedly, if you listen to Virgil, you were supposed to spare the downtrodden. You're supposed to be trying to lift up the downtrodden. and subdue the proud, and instead you're turning on people unjustly treated and trying to rub it in, trying to make them feel that they're somehow at fault here, or that their religion is at fault. And this can stem from nothing other than pride. And so that's not seeing things as they are. Secondly, then, and I'm skipping over what he does in Book 2, very interesting, very important, I think, but too much to do here. So to Book 3. Book 3, I think Augustine shows the pagan interlocutor how the misery and unnatural injustice, you could say, that pride causes is seen in pre-Christian Rome in its worst in the way it turns against natural ties of familial affection, in the love between parents and children, in the love between spouses, in the love between betrothed, that's the beginnings of spousal love, in the love between siblings. And politics turning against that, when it becomes lust for domination, absolutizing, divinizing of civic glory, it turns against the most natural ties that sustain human life and happiness among persons. And it undoes them and harms human happiness in a very serious way. The most striking example of the many, many Augustine gives to show how this happens is in the very ancient years of the Roman Republic, the war between Rome and Alba, a neighboring city whom Rome attacked, and a city that was in many ways, Augustine suggests, Rome's mother city. There were many citizens who came from Alba. There was quite a bit of intermarriage between the two cities, and so it was an impious war in the original sense of the serious evil and offense to divinity that happens when there is bloodshed and murder in the family. So even just as a city fighting a city, Augustine shows this is terrible. But then things peak. It gets, just when the war is over, and you think things have to start getting better, Augustine says, no, you see the worst moment of this whole sad story. The war was so bad that eventually the two sides decided to have the dispute settled by hand-to-hand combat, and each city sent a team of 3 brothers to do this combat for their city. Rome's brothers, 2 of them perished, but the third killed all 3 brothers from Alba in the end, and came home bearing the trophies of his triumph. That was also his city's triumph. He came bearing the bloody gear of the Albans he had killed. When he came home, his sister burst into tears when she saw what he was carrying, because one of the Albans whom he had killed was her fiancé, and she also knew, presumably, her 2 other brothers had died in the conflict. But she burst into tears when she saw her fiancé's bloody gear carried by her brother who had killed him. Augustine suggests this is and then her brother kills her. Her brother she's not patriotic enough. She's turning against Rome. She's a traitor, and he kills her. And her father defends her brother. And he's acquitted in court by Rome. So at this point, Augustine says that this young woman who burst into tears finally shows us, and here I'm paraphrasing at this point, shows us finally an action that's right according to human nature. What's right is to weep and mourn. This is terrible. And he says explicitly that she possesses more humanity than the entire Roman people. So at this point then, Augustine has praised her as, again, finally showing some humility and appropriate, he doesn't explicitly praise her humility, but yes, her humanity. And I think it's also because she's capable of mercy and compassion in the way that is a natural foreshadowing of the union of justice and mercy in Augustine. All right, so then Augustine argues for moderation as a virtue. He speaks of 2 human beings who he, in a sense, does Socrates' number a little differently. As Socrates founds 2 cities in speech in Plato's Republic, so we can see justice and then understand it in the human soul, Augustine reverses that. He says, no, we'll understand moderation better if we paint 2 different people. And then extend the meaning of moderation out into families, cities, and empires. And he shows in a very creative way how, and I think very effectively, how a moderate life is a happier one, so also for political communities, is the conclusion of his argument. But then he turns back to Roman religion, polytheistic Roman religion, and he suggests, well, gee, it hasn't really encouraged moderation at all. Look at these Roman gods. They're not moderate. They're not just. They are feverish. They're greedy. They're envious. They're anything but moderate and just. Well, then he says, but you have to look at these philosophic reinterpretations of these Roman gods. Look at Varro. Look at even Virgil's poetic reinterpretation, that all the gods are just aspects of the one God. And there is only one God who is, in a sense, it's a pantheistic God, the world soul. But Augustine says that's an improvement. We've gotten to one God. But to get where we need to go, we need to understand the distinction between the creator and the creation, the transcendence of the creator and the dependence of all created nature on the distinct nature of the creator, something who's not a part of nature, infinitely transcending it. So Augustine then gives a Neoplatonic argument in a nutshell that he thinks could have convinced Varro, perhaps, and then grounded not just moderation, but humility. He writes, so close to the truth, Varro might have, perhaps, been easily persuaded of the mutability of soul, and so have come to understand that the true God is that immutable nature which created the soul itself. All right, there's more to be said, but I'll just skip to one quote from Book 19 by way of conclusion. Meanwhile, Augustine has said in Book 5, he's shown how humility helps to moderate the love of glory, it elevates love of justice, it makes possible a purified public service on behalf of others, it extends familial affection to care and concern for the poor and the abandoned of society. Humility, which is open to and eventually at one with love and with mercy and with justice. And so humility has a great role to play in the establishment of justice. In Book 19, Augustine explains how humility is, in a sense, justice as follows. He says, the task of justice is to give each his due. It is for this reason that there is established in man himself a certain just order of nature, such that the soul is subordinated to God and the body to the soul, and thus both the body and the soul are subordinated to God. Thank you.
We started a few minutes late, so we still have a few minutes for questions. So if people would do as is customary and line up at the microphones, we can have our panel can begin to take your questions.
Hi there, Patrick Deneen, recently of Notre Dame, and first of all, 3 great presentations. I pinch myself that I have colleagues now, such as you. I would love to ask a question to each of you, but I want to direct one question to Brad Gregory. You left us, and my head almost fell off nodding to everything you said, but you left us with more hope than I tend to have. That we are still capable of living lives of Christian witness and of Christian charity. I don't gainsay or debate any of that, but our church has over the centuries developed institutions that are we see as part of our ministry. We're gathered in one here, our universities, our schools, our hospitals, and it seems to me one is perhaps justified in being less sanguine about the prospects of our institutions. And in particular, we've seen with precisely the trajectory that you've described, how adoption agencies in places like Massachusetts have been essentially forced to close, how potentially institutions such as this one may be forced to reflect on whether or not we can continue if the, for example, the HHS mandate is determined to be by our judicial system, by our state, to be acceptable. And so I guess I would want to ask you, given the trajectory that you described, whether we can be sanguine about the ministry that we now undertake in our institutions, or whether in some senses that ministry and our actions and activities and lives of Christian witness will in some ways be forced back into the catacombs.
Well, Patrick, as you know, I'm the last person to be sanguine. Exactly. I certainly don't think there's cause to be sanguine. In fact, when I was writing this paper, I thought, you know what, I got to say something positive at the end. I mean, it's all these good people at this conference, and if I just leave it hanging there at the end, but that's really going to be a downer, and so we have to at least say something. So I had a kind of a tentative conclusion prepared, and then after Alistair spoke yesterday afternoon, I went back and revised it a little because that inspired me. I'm not sanguine. I mean, I really think the more clearly that one sees the dominant trajectories, the prevailing ethos, where power really lies in this society, and the dominant, I would say, influences that shape our lives, I don't think it's heartening. I really don't. I think, though, that we know, we're convinced, we attempt to live out as Catholics that whatever happens, God's truth will prevail. The church cannot be overcome, even if it's, persecuted, even if it is in dire straits, and even if the situation looks grim. But I do think there are real day-to-day opportunities, and something like this conference is one of them. The ways in which we interact with people in our lives is another, in which genuine goodness, real virtues, and joy can be expressed and lived out. And I think those things are absolutely critical, and quite frankly, without them, I don't know how we would go on. So part of when I said, we should stop thinking in terms of the kind of macro-social, macro-political solutions, like let's just get the blueprint, then we'll implement it, and everything will be fine. I think that's not a good way it's not a good way to try to go about it, but it's also psychologically debilitating. To dwell on those things all the time really is darkening, at least in my experience. That's a rambling answer, but...
Okay. I think we can have time to fit all the questions in if people speak in one sentence with a maximum of 3 relative clauses.
Yeah,
So
and if the respondent is less verbose.
I'll
I
try.
wasn't referring to the panel.
Counter-observation. We're descending into secularism everywhere. However, think about places in London or Paris where there are communities that are resisting this trend, and I refer to Islam and the attempts to impose Sharia. And ordinarily, I'd be depressed as all heck about that as well, but after Tuesday, I'm starting to think, and to you, how do we get a slice of that action? And if so, should we?
Yeah.
Good question.
That's for me? That's for me? Oh, just real quickly, I mean, I think, issues and possibilities like that should be discussed. I mean, I don't have blueprints. That's not my thing. I study the past and try to understand how it shaped the present. That's where my mandate ends. So other people who are wiser than I and can see into the future or foreign policies and so forth, I think ought to comment on that. Do you guys want to?
Go ahead. Do you have thoughts, John?
No, in keeping with our moderator's injunction.
I was tempted to say something very pessimistic, thinking about Charles V's pillage of Rome in May 1527, much worse than what Alaric did. But I will not try to defend my Gothic ancestors. Professor Gregory, I thought you were right on. It's too late for Augustine. It's too late for philosophy. Perhaps it's Ignatius of Antioch, where at the parish, where at the diocese, we use the two great weapons given to Christianity: love, which includes almsgiving, and prayer. And then, not from the top down, I mean, we've spent the inheritance of St. Constantine the Great. There was still something there when Augustine was writing. So it's totally disanalogous to our situation. We have to go back to where Ignatius of Antioch was and reclaim the world for Christ from the bottom up.
Any comments?
You know about early Christianity, John. You know about early Christianity.
Because
Yeah,
unfortunately, I didn't quite understand the whole question.
Yeah. We have to reclaim the church from the bottom up rather than thinking top-down terms. And Ignatius of Antioch should be one of our inspirers. I think he's agreeing.
Did you want to say anything, Mary? Okay.
No, just, although I don't want to give up on philosophy yet, I agree with your statement that we need it. The Church of the Martyrs is also where we need to go back to.
I think you were next, so please.
My question is addressed to Professor Keyes and Professor Cavadini because it's about Augustine. I'm not as certain that we can get, that it's too late for Augustine because Augustine's coming from a fractured society and he has an account that's applicable to different types of people, which I think was the point that was well made by Mary. But in Cavadini's presentation, you said that works of mercy are works of justice for Augustine. And that's the same point that you came to by the end of your paper. Mm-hmm. So what is a practical example of that, I hate to say that could take a policy form? Because if we're trying to address like a broader audience, what could we identify as an example of mercy that is also an example of justice that could be committed by political actors today?
I'll sort of hazard a guess, but I mean, not really a guess. I think in terms of policy formation, immigration would be one place to look. I think that you can't have justice if you don't also have a real solidarity with the suffering of large groups of the immigrants who come here without documentation. And at the same time, one needs to be seeking ways of giving them access to society and path to citizenship that also is, how to say it, keeping in mind the needs of the populations that are already here. And but I think you can't do justice without mercy, period. But that's, I think, maybe an obvious policy. That doesn't give you your solution, but it tells you that if Augustine's right, which I think he is, justice depends on mercy. That they're one thing in the end.
Our last question.
Professor Gregory, your talk reminded me of a 20th century allegory, Siddhartha, where the protagonist is miserable at both extremes, both asceticism on one side of the river and hedonism on the other side of the river, and he eventually finds his enlightenment in the middle way. Right? And so would it be fair to say that the Reformation in colonial America is the asceticism side of the river, and now modern America, or at least Pat Benatar's America, is sort of the hedonistic side, where the conventional wisdom is that the path to happiness is through personal gain and sensual pleasure and so forth. And if that's a fair analogy, maybe we'll go back to your predictions. Are they still sanguine or pessimistic, or what are they? Is America going to find this middle, popular America going to find its way back to the middle way, or are we doomed to live out our life in hedonism?
I mean, I definitely don't think we're doomed. I mean, good. That's the upside. Okay. Human beings really are, within the conditions in which we find ourselves, we have choices to make. We can choose to live different ways and can choose to actualize certain possibilities rather than others. So there's always hope in that sense. But I think we should not kid ourselves about what it would really mean significantly to change direction as far as a society that, to all appearances, is simply bent on the acquisition of more and better stuff as the sine qua non, overwhelming majority of the population. Doesn't matter whether you're buying at Walmart or Bloomingdale's. People want more and better stuff. Our entire political, economic system is organized around that. It is globalized around that. Labor is outsourced to serve that end. It doesn't matter that in the 20th century, average per capita income in the United States increased 8-fold in real terms from 1900 to 2000. Ever more and better stuff. If you have the economic means, you can do whatever you want with your money. We have laws that enable people essentially to do that. That's what a real reorientation has to resist. Because what's happened in the course of the same centuries, but with a different analytical lens, is that what once was the deadly sin of avarice is now sweetly benign self-interest. And that's a big thing that we're going to have to push against.
Before ending, I wanted to know whether Professor Cavadini wanted to say something in response to the previous question. I don't know if I have a sense I may have cut you off. Did you have a response to the previous question, or to any of the questions?
Justice and mercy and policy.
I kind of forget the question.
Okay. We'll probably end the session on that note. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists, and also to those of you for your patience.